All right. Hi, everyone. This is day 2 of 3 for the Summer Twilight launch weekend. I'm Bridget, the author of Summer Twilight, and this is actually of the various sort of celebrations. This is the one I'm most excited for because this is the one where not only do I get to share some of the story with you guys, but I also get to give you sort of the director's cut behind the scenes perspective on what is in the story and sort of what was going through my mind as I was creating it and the different chapters, and you really get insight into this process. What inspired me to do this was actually one of my biggest sources of writing inspiration overall, which is Lord of the Rings. So I am a big fan of the Lord of the Rings extended edition movies. And one of the reasons I'm such a big fan is because in Lord of the Rings, in the extended edition, they have like 8 different types of commentary you can choose to be able to listen to the movie with. So you can choose to listen to the directors talk about the movie. You can listen to the actors. You can listen to like the videographers. Unfortunately for you guys, you just have me. But I want to do my best to give you guys that same experience, to be able to hear sort of what was going through my mind on these different chapters. And especially with the first couple of chapters in the book, I really had a hard time with some portions of these chapters. And I think that's important to acknowledge. I'm really, really proud of the way they turned out, and I'm really excited to share with you guys how we got there. But I'm also really excited to be able to talk about, what the struggles were and how I overcame them. So today I'm going to read you the first few chapters. We've got an hour together, so we're definitely going to look at chapter 1 and chapter 2. If there's time, we might get to chapter 3, but I'm not positive about that one. Chapters 1 and 2 focus on Alex, who's one of 2 main characters. He and Katie are the 2 main characters in the book. And Alex, the book starts with Alex returning home. He was born and raised in Rosemore, which we talked about yesterday, the province where the story takes place. But he has been away from home for about 4 years when the book starts. And so it's this weird feeling of coming home and everything feels the same, but somehow so different. It's kind of like if you've ever gone back to like your elementary school where, you spent 5 or 6 years of your life. And when you were there, you knew the halls, you knew the chairs, you knew what the gym smelled like. When you go back, it feels really like similar, right? Not that much has changed, but you're so much bigger and it seems like everything has changed, even though things are really the same. So that's really a lot of what Alex is grappling with. I'm going to be reading you guys these chapters. I'll share my screen in just a second so you can follow along. But the other thing I just want to sort of let you guys in on right now is that as I pause throughout the chapter, I'll read a section, then I'll sort of pause and talk about it and some of the challenges and what changed, things like that. While I'm really, really proud of the way these chapters turned out, I also want to talk to you guys about some of the biggest difficulties I had writing them. And the first thing to know is that my editor, the biggest piece of feedback he gave me after reading my first draft, he was like, "This is great. You've got a great story. I love where it's going. I love the creativity. I don't care about Alex." And I was like, that's not great because Alex is one of my main characters. And if you don't care about him, what do you care about, right? What's the point? So I really had to go back and do some workshopping. And the first thing I did was actually at the very beginning of chapter 1, I backed it up a little bit. So the first part of chapter 1, which we'll get to in just a second, is actually some of the newest portion that I wrote. Is one of the last things I wrote in the entire book, because I had to give Alex that space to sort of like have his own internal monologue and think about things. So I am going to share this, and you should see this sort of pop up if you want to follow along. But like I said, I'll read and I'll sort of pause from time to time and let you guys in. So chapter 1 takes place on the 3rd day of the harvest moon. Alex shook himself awake in the cool pre-dawn twilight. Lying on his back, staring up at the stars strewn across the darkness, he stretched expansively, yawning and trying to rub the sleep from his eyes. Today is the day. He knew he'd reach Aira, the capital of Rosemore, by first light. If he'd pushed a little harder, he could have gotten there yesterday, but he wanted to be fresh and braced for the encounter to come. He felt wide awake, even though he tossed and turned through most of the night on the hard-packed earth. Distracted thoughts had spent the night doing their best to ward off sleep. Would his parents be at the castle or home with his younger sister? Would the guards recognize him? Probably not, he thought ruefully. It's been a hard few years. Nervously, he ran his fingers through his hair, feeling the welcome cool of night on his scalp. May as well get on with it. With a heavy sigh, mostly for dramatic effect, though his only audience was his horse, who looked at him with one tired eye, he rolled to his feet. So that was a portion that I rewrote, I added, because I really wanted you guys, the audience, to feel like you were in the moment with Alex. You got his internal monologue. Who can't relate to getting up right before the beginning of a big day and feeling sort of nervous and anxious, but also excited, right? And so immediately you, as the audience, hopefully, start to feel sort of tugged into the character. I love Alex and the way he interacts with his horse as well. I do this with my dog all the time. I'll turn and I'll like talk to her about how things are going, and she just looks at me like, okay, like, so what? But as humans, we really like to sort of narrate our actions. He packed quickly, storing his bedroll with practiced ease and saddling his mount. Enough moonlight still shone so he could see what he was doing, though at this point, muscle memory had taken over his motions. I've been on the road too long, he decided as he tightened the girth around his horse's belly. I promise you all the hay and apples you can stand, my girl, he murmured, running his fingers through the mare's knotted mane. No more long trips for a while. If I don't screw up, we should be here for a few years at least. The pair had been riding for the last few hot weeks of summer, from the Whispering Plains in southern Dannon up past Glassfall Lake, following the Twin River to the north and racing to beat the imperial missive that would warn the province of his arrival. A constant pull, a magnetic drag on his discipline, had grown stronger the further he rode. He'd come to realize that, for the first time in a long time, he was excited to return. I can't believe we'll be home. Well, I'll be home. You've never been somewhere that gets this cold, he continued, checking the straps on his bedroll behind the saddle. The stables stay fairly warm, though, I think. His mare snorted and turned her head away, and Alex chuckled to himself. Humming a tuneless song under his breath, he finished packing up his campsite with the efficiency of one who's just as comfortable sleeping under the sky as in a bed. It was also a convenient way to ignore the tingle of nerves in his fingertips and stomach. So this portion originally happened a lot later on in the chapter, and I moved it up forward because I wanted you guys, the audience, to have this opportunity to get this hint that Alex is almost trying to outrun something, right? He's racing this missive to get home, and we don't know why yet, right? Like why he wants to beat it, why that matters. But you get this sense that there's maybe a little bit more here, right? He's not just a traveler. He's not just coming home. He hasn't just been reassigned. There's something else going on. There's something else sort of happening in the wings. So that was one reason this portion right here, this middle paragraph where we talk about him riding up from the Whispering Plains past Glassfall Lake, which is more of a tongue twister than I thought it was, and then following the Twin River. If you think about it, that's how we talk about things in real life, right? If I'm describing a trip I just took to a friend, I might say like, oh yeah, like I hopped on 395, I took it out till I got to Front Royal, then I got on, 66 or whatever. And by doing that, right, it helps us feel more grounded. This world already feels like somewhere that you can sort of picture in your head, right? Okay, he was in these big plains. Now he rode past this lake. He followed this river, and now he's getting home. And especially if you take that paired with the map that we talked about yesterday, that's at the beginning of the book, right? You start to have this really good picture in your head of not only where he was, but sort of the path he followed. And he's been on the road for a while. I have nothing to be nervous about, he tried to reassure himself. I'll just get my orders signed, then fade into the back alleys. The small voice in the back of his head pointed out there were, in fact, many things to be nervous about, from seeing her again to withstanding the infamous temper of the Lord of Rosemore. But he chose to ignore his nerves, instead imagining the first steaming flagon of honeycomb tea he'd enjoy as a reward for his journey. It's been years since I've gotten real honeycomb tea. Hauling himself into the saddle, Alex groaned as he forced his legs to straddle the mount. Everything ached, from his eyebrows to his toes, and fierce bruises felt like a permanent new addition to his thighs. I'd forgotten how uncomfortable it is to ride for 2 weeks straight, he thought ruefully. Once he settled, excitement fizzed through his veins once more. He'd see Katie again. As her name echoed through his mind, guilt grew hot in his stomach, tangled with the nerves. She is going to be furious, he muttered, turning his mare and trotting back towards the main road. She'll never let me live it down. In all fairness, he guessed that disappearing in the middle of the night to travel halfway across the empire probably wasn't conducive to a healthy long-term relationship. Easier for me, he thought. If she's angry, I don't have to lie to her. Katie's fury was nearly as famous in noble circles as her father's. The relationship between Alex and Katie throughout the entire book is really, really important. I actually describe this book as a romance, even though there isn't actually a whole lot of traditional romance in it. Alex and Katie aren't together, as you're starting to get hints now, right? They were in a relationship. Alex left. He actually disappeared in the middle of the night. And so things sort of ended badly between them. But they aren't in a traditional sort of boyfriend-girlfriend situation or like an engaged couple relationship. Instead, they're best friends. They were childhood sweethearts. They fell in love with each other when they were very young. And then when Alex left, it was really devastating. And so it was really, really important, and something that my editor helped me figure out how to paint in was this idea that Alex would be really, really nervous, not just about coming home, not just about whatever his job is, but about seeing this girl that he left behind. And that would be something, think about the last time you saw an ex or you saw somebody that you had a really big crush on, right? Especially if things didn't end well, right? We've all been there, and it's kind of terrifying. It's overwhelming. And even if you're trying really, really hard not to think about it, you still it gets stuck in your head. And so her being on his mind and sort of popping up, even though he's trying to stay focused, was something that I wanted to have happen, but not happen to the point where you guys, the readers, were like, all right, we get it, let's move on, right? It needs to be frequent enough that you understand how important she is to him, but not so frequent that you're like, all right, next, right? So this portion right here is really about setting all of that up. It's setting up not only is he excited to be home, but there's this relationship here that he left behind that he's returning to. Long journeys, Alex knew too well, had a way of melting days and weeks together until the end seemed forever out of reach. In some ways, he'd been waiting to come home for the past several years, not merely the weeks he'd been riding. It seemed like something from a drunken hallucination then, when his horse crested a hill and the moon-drenched valley he'd grown up in was unfurled before his eyes. So, the briefest of pauses here. This next portion you'll hear was actually some of the first words I ever wrote for the book. And it is almost unchanged. Not 100%. There was obviously edits that happened. But when I first sat down to write Summer Twilight, 8 years ago, when the idea first came into my head, this was the way that the setting looked and was described. And it's one of the probably only pieces of the book that has 100% survived from that time, because this image was just so clear and so true in my head. Finally, he murmured, rubbing a hand along his horse's warm neck and feeling himself smile, genuinely, for the first time since his ride began. Rolling hills covered in lush farmland and neatly kept homes stretched across the basin, filled with common folk leading easy, comfortable lives. A lazy river turned through the valley, tumbling into rapids as it flowed west towards the Viridian Sea. Light woodland covered most of the eastern side of the dale, stretching up the mountains. Across the valley, a city, surrounded by high stone walls, blanketed the lakeshore, glittering with torchlight. Aira. Even from here, he could make out the great plaza atop City Hill, which gave a panoramic view of the entire valley. Aira was one of the largest cities in Rosemore and the capital of the province. A paved road curved from the city proper up the mountainside, leading to a castle perched amid the great peaks lining the northern end of the valley. Everything was gilded with moonlight, lending a haunting sheen to the world. A wintry wind caused his horse to stamp nervously, tossing its head and snorting. Summer was fading, and the chill of autumn was in the air that morning. Alex checked the clasp on his cloak, a circular piece of metal split in two with a single line, as the wind caught the underside of the wool, cutting into his chafed skin. Wrapping the cloak tightly around his shoulders, he leaned into his stirrups, letting the weight of his heels stretch the back of his calves, and urged his horse down the steep mountainside. He instinctively leaned back to remove weight from the shoulders of his weary mount as they picked their way through the rocks and into the valley. So that picture of Rosemore is one that I've had for almost a decade. This idea of sort of this early morning dawn dusk, right? Just as the sun is starting to inch over the horizon. It's not light yet, but you're starting to get that sort of silvery light of the morning. There's maybe mist coating the fields, and you're perched up on the top of this sort of rise, looking down into this valley. And the thing about Rosemore that I love is that it is supposed to feel both fantastical and wild and medieval and unlike anything we have today, and as though you could walk out your door, take a vacation, get on a plane, and go there, right? It's supposed to feel real and accessible, but at the same time, sort of perfect and removed. And so that description, Alex's reaction to coming home, obviously that's through his eyes, right? He loves this province, he loves this city. But for you, the reader, you're immediately, ideally, pulled into that moment with him, and you're able to sort of live it alongside him. So now that we've set up the setting, we dive more deeply into some of just the basic backbone of the politics of the world, because we're in this completely foreign place. To him, and to most, Rosemore Dell, the northwesternmost province of the Mizrahi Empire, was idyllic in nearly every sense of the word. Nestled between the peaks and plateaus of the somber mountains and the white-capped waves of the Iranian Sea, the province was mostly removed from the politics of the empire and boasted prosperous farmland. It was a life steeped in village festivals and market days, in which honest folk worked hard and the nobility didn't concern themselves with much outside their manners. Days here were simple and filled with a gentle satisfaction. He had grown up here, had whiled away a childhood filled with stars and mountain twilight, a life of rolling down hillsides and scampering through city streets. It seemed a world apart from the one he knew now. If he closed his eyes, the air still tasted like fresh buns stuffed with cinnamon and honey, with plenty of laughter and smiles to go around. There had been mountains to climb, hidden corridors of the castle to explore, and plenty of adventures to be had on the Twin River in a makeshift raft. Those were the days. That paragraph has also survived pretty much since draft one. And to me, this really captures the nostalgia of childhood that I think, I'm a young adult. This book is targeted at sort of new adults, so people in their early 20s. I think a lot of us can connect with, right? When we go back to our hometowns, we go back to where we grew up. We have all these positive memories of sledding, of ice skating, of, going and picking flowers or exploring the woods. And it just feels a little bit different. And you can't really articulate why, but you're sort of lost in these memories and at the same time feeling very separate. And then here we start to transition into giving you more hints at what Alex's job is and the sort of duality in which he sees the world. As he wandered through his memories, a part of Alex's mind remained calmly alert, watching a flock of starlings spring into the morning air and listening closely for the tired mumblings of civilization. Farmers would be awake soon, and merchants would start trundling their caravans to Ayura's markets. The cool pre-dawn wind continued to tug at the blue wool of his cloak, whipping off his hood as his horse slid and scrambled down the rocky trail. Soon, the path flattened into the valley, and a stone bridge arched over a tributary, leading into a patchwork of lightly wooded farmland. A guardhouse stood by the bridge, and the provincial guard inside waved Alex onward without any hassle. That doesn't instill confidence, he thought, frowning. Guardhouses like these were designed as checkpoints to ensure nothing strange or dangerous was making its way too close to Ayura. The last thing I need is lazy guards letting in a criminal, or, God's forbid, a freelark dandelion, into the city. He caught a glimpse of chairs drawn up to a table inside the guardhouse, tankards, and some sort of game scattered across the surface. He clicked his tongue impatiently against his teeth, absently digging his heels into his horse's warm sides and rewrapping the reins around gloved hands. They clattered across the bridge, his horse adopting a smooth, rocking canter. Nearing the outskirts of the city, Alex's nerves returned. It was very strange, he realized, to be coming home because Rosemore didn't completely feel like home anymore. He'd done quite a good job of forcing that out of his mind during the journey, pushing himself and his mount to a breaking point rather than thinking about the past. Now, drawing unavoidably closer to Ira and the world he'd left behind, it was impossible to ignore. There was no forgetting the night he'd been taken away from his bed, spirited across the empire to arid deserts unlike anything he'd ever known, or the hot earth burning his feet in the hard, endless expanse of sand and stone. During those first years of his training, thoughts of home, of Katie, had pulled him through. He dreamt of coming back to her, leaving the hard, distrustful world of the blades behind, trading it all for a life at her side. When had that changed? He couldn't point to any one moment in his recent memory when he had turned his back on Rosemore, on Katie, and dedicated himself to the service. And yet, now mere moments from his home, from her, the longing he'd felt had faded. He missed her, but there was more to life now. He had responsibilities to people and ideas greater than himself. So this is a really common theme I know that I've experienced, that a lot of my friends have experienced, where you get into your early 20s and you reevaluate your priorities, right? When I was 15, I wanted to be the next Hannah Montana. Obviously, that's not my plan anymore, right? And that's because things changed, right? I realized what I wanted to do with my life, or at least what I think I want to do with my life. And I learned a lot about what makes me happy and what doesn't make me happy. And so even though I still love performing, I love singing, I love acting, that's not a part of my life that's as close to me as it used to be, which is really weird to think about. Like, there was a time in my life that musical theater was my entire world. It was all I did all the time. And so it's very, very challenging to sort of grapple with that, with the idea that something that was once so important to you now isn't as important. And that's especially so when you're dealing with people, right? It's especially so when you're thinking about friends that you were best friends with in middle school and high school, and then something changed, right? You moved apart, or you just started working on different things and became interested in different things. And it doesn't mean you don't care for the person anymore, but something has changed. And that's even harder when the other person doesn't feel the same way, right? They still consider you a best friend or somebody incredibly important, and you don't feel that way. And that's something we all deal with. We don't like talking about it. It's kind of uncomfortable, but we all go through it. And that's one of the big themes in this book, is this idea that we all have these shared experiences that we don't necessarily talk about, but sort of unite us as humans. Alex reached the fortified gates of the city just as the first shafts of sunlight dappled the fields and farmers began to emerge from tidy homes nearby. Slowing to a trot, his horse passed unimpeded through the gate, dirt turning to cobblestones underfoot. It was still early, so very few people were outside. Those who were moved with lethargy, rubbing sleepy eyes and ambling slowly through the streets. Good, he thought. Less of a chance I'll be waylaid. Traffic outside the city would pick up as farmers brought their wagons to the market for the day. It was faster to wind through the twisted city streets than fight through the mire of oxen, horses, produce, and people outside. Despite the quiet inside the city walls, he guided his horse through back alleys, the less well-to-do areas of Ira, avoiding the city center and busier streets. They passed a pig snuffling through damp leaves and 3 chickens pecking at a bare dirt of a small fenced yard. From inside houses, the domestic sounds of children waking up, babies crying, and parents cooking breakfast floated towards them on the breeze. Riding past the market square, the tantalizing smell of fresh meat pasties and honeycomb tea wafted past them. Alex drew his mount to a halt, letting the smell wash over him. The horse stamped its hoof to express its displeasure at stopping. "Easy, my friend. We'll be there soon enough," he murmured. Just a fun sort of Easter egg tidbit. In almost every chapter Alex is in, not all of them, but almost everyone, Alex is either eating or drinking or thinking about eating or drinking. There are 2 reasons for that. I think, first of all, it's really relatable. I know in my life, I am constantly eating or drinking or thinking about eating or drinking, right? Like plotting my next meal. And then also, it really helps you feel grounded. My least favorite kind of sort of creative situation is like in the TV show 24, where the characters never stop to eat. They never stop to go to the bathroom. They never bathe themselves, right? They just keep going and going and going throughout their day. And it feels very inhuman. And that is a foundational message of this book, is that, you're not a superhero. None of us are superheroes. None of us are perfect. We're all very deeply flawed people. The characters in this book are all very deeply flawed. They make bad decisions. But that's real. That's authentic. It's not like they're these perfect, all-powerful, like Tolkien elves who know everything and do everything. Instead, you as a reader can feel more connected to them. So you'll spot a lot of food throughout the book. I was also usually hungry when I was writing, which is probably why so much food is in the book. Unexpectedly, he felt his breath catch in his throat as he looked around, and he leaned forward, burying his face in the rough mane of his horse. Everything washed over him at once, sharp pangs of loneliness, deep unsettled fears, and an overwhelming sense that he didn't belong. He felt foreign and unfamiliar in a city he had once roamed as a child, holding court on the sidewalks and clambering on rooftops. It was a strange and terrifying feeling to be returning as a stranger to his hometown. "I hate it," he whispered into his horse's neck. "Everything feels wrong." The world around him, the warm honeycomb tea and fresh meat pies he used to enjoy on the edge of a fountain, and the quiet burble of families starting the morning, was all discordant. He found himself desperately, painfully wishing he'd never left. Alex allowed himself one more moment. He forced himself to take several deep breaths before wrapping his arms tightly around his mount's neck until he felt his heartbeat slow. Objectively, he had always known it would be different. Why was different so hard? Straightening and rubbing his eyes with gloved fingers, he longed to dismount and wait until the market opened. A hot meal would help everything feel better. It always did. But then, he argued with himself, rumor of a blade could reach Lord Matthias before I can. That won't do. Regretfully, he discarded the notion of stopping. He'd almost reached the end of his trek across the Empire. If he dismounted now, he wouldn't have had the grit to pull himself back into the saddle. He rolled his shoulders twice, then squared them. Drawing himself in and forcing his emotions away, he urged the horse forward once more. A moment of weakness was natural, he told himself, but now it was time for action, and action required disciplined control. He could no longer afford even the perception of vulnerability. A blade knows all, sees all, and tells few. He wrapped himself in the aura of mystery his new station provided. And that's really the moment of vulnerability we see from Alex. And in this first chapter, that's what used to be missing. The reason Alex wasn't likable was he was just this cold, detached, blade that didn't have emotions, that wasn't feeling torn up about coming home, that just was sort of had his poker face on the whole time. And that was really antithetical to the message that I wanted to be sending, that it's okay to have these conflicting emotions, that sometimes we make decisions that are really hard, that we overcome them and we get through them. And so adding in this moment for him where he's in this back alley, all he wants to do is go eat his favorite breakfast, visit his favorite places, see his favorite people, but he knows he can't. And I think that's something that a lot of us can relate to in some capacity or another. And I think that's something that helps Alex be much more, hopefully, likable, right? You understand why he seems kind of cool and detached because you've seen how he is barely holding it together, right? He was just there doubled over on his horse, trying not to cry. And he's putting on his poker face and he's moving forward. He's just doing his best. By the time horse and rider emerged the western edge of the city, the first few wagons were jostling through the gates with goods to sell, and children were appearing in doorways, clinging to their mothers' skirts. It was still early enough that most people moved slowly with heads down, though several sets of children wound their way between horses' legs and wagon wheels, bored from their trip to the city and excited for candies and toys, which would soon be for sale. Struggling through the tide of animals and carts, Alex exited through the western gate towards the castle on the hill. They passed the major crossroads where many of the merchants and farmers were fighting their way towards the market stalls. The road to the castle itself was much emptier, a winding series of switchbacks built into and around the hill. It was carved into the gentlest part of the slope, and the rest of the hillside either melted into the surrounding mountains or dropped away into rough, rocky ledges. Eyeing the defenses as he passed, he noted only one gatehouse with a wooden stockade between the castle and the city, manned by 3 sleepy guards who had their crossbows unstrung on a table. At the 2 sharpest switchbacks, there were defenses higher up the path, cauldrons for pitch and traps filled with boulders intended to block travel. He also noted the tightly oiled packets, which were just visible, wedged into the stone beneath corners. As he rode by, he leaned out of his saddle slightly, then nodded. He could see the faint opalescent sheen coating the parcels and knew they held mage-fire jelly. The jelly was a trap from before the cleansing, a sticky, viscous substance that was highly combustible. He suspected these parcels were tied to magical command keys, which could be snapped to collapse part of the road. That was the idea, anyway. It was just as possible, if not more likely, that the keys had been lost or that the parcels were old defenses no one had bothered to remove. It was an odd vestige of paranoia in the sheltered province. Rosemore had not faced assault since the cleansing, a few generations ago. However, despite the impressive variety of defenses, the only set of patrolling guards Alex rode by seemed distracted and disinterested, ready for the shift change, likely in a few hours. He ground his teeth in frustration. What use are traps if there's no one there to man them? So here, in that passage, is really where we start to get a good sense of who Alex is and what his job might have to do with. Now, you guys obviously know it's not a secret. He's a blade. He's a spy. And his job is to try and protect the Empire from threats, both foreign and domestic, right? But he's now coming home. He's coming home with this new way of looking at the world, this way flavored by sort of paranoia and concentrating on defenses and looking for ways out. And he's seeing just how unsafe everything is. It's kind of like if you've never lived somewhere that's been affected directly by war, right? You don't understand what it's like to live in a war zone. And so Alex, who's been away, who's been encountering all these different things, is coming home and realizing that even though Rosemore seems incredibly safe, it's actually very, very vulnerable. A messenger, clothed in a gold-striped tunic and leggings, jogged past him and down the hill, carrying a satchel meant for someone in the city. Seeing as she was on foot, it obviously wasn't urgent. Alex turned away from her as she passed, keeping his face in shadow, then twisted to watch her disappear down the road towards the knot of wagons at the base of the hill. His horse tossed its head impatiently before snorting in satisfaction when they continued on their way. "Do you have something else to do today?" Alex quipped, a little amused. When they reached the gate at the top of the hill, Alex paused for a moment, leaning back in the saddle and looking up at the castle. It was an old fortress, the tall stone walls built into the side of the mountain and slotted with arrow slits. The battlements overlooked one of the most beautiful vistas in the entire empire. Towers scraped the sky behind the wall, and he counted 3 sets of guards. He felt a scratchiness in the back of his throat and a heat behind his eyes as he looked up at Ayera Castle. It had been home for many years, and the warm stones were as familiar as the scent of honeycomb tea sold in the city. Taking a deep breath, he steeled his nerves for what was to come. There's no way out now. And that's the end of chapter 1. Originally, chapter 1 lasted about another 2,000 words. I sort of defaulted to longer chapters, but both me and my editor decided this would be a really good place to break it, right? It gives Alex some room to breathe, to be himself, for us to sort of follow his journey back home. And then it still keeps you wanting to turn the page without being like, oh my God, how long is this chapter? So what we're going to do now, we've met Alex, one of our 2 main characters. We're actually going to skip chapter 2 and we're going to go to chapter 3, which is told from Katie's perspective as opposed to Alex's. The book alternates between the 2. And one thing I worked really, really hard on and hopefully pulled off was the idea that Alex and Katie should feel like two very different people. They see the world very differently. They have different priorities. They have different things they're excited about. And they have different sort of ways of entertaining themselves. And because they've had these different life experiences, even if they're looking at the exact same scene, you shouldn't feel like you're hearing one narrator describe the scene. You should feel like you have two completely different people looking at the same situation. One of them might be noticing the colors and the gowns, while the other one might be noticing what weapons are people carrying, right? Both those things are important, but depending on our priorities, we'll see different things. So the book alternates. My original plan was to have one chapter from Alex, one chapter from Katie, and just flip-flop back and forth throughout the entire book. In this case, it ends up sort of being a couple of chapters from one, a couple of chapters from the other. And I think that works out a lot better because it gives them more space to sort of have character development, to breathe and to be themselves without feeling rushed, like you just have to tell the story and get the exposition out. So this is Katie we're about to dive into. And again, this beginning that I'm going to read you, this is left over from the very first draft. This has been how Katie was introduced for as long as she's existed. And I think is very, very authentically true to who she is. Chapter 3, the third day of the harvest moon. So this is the same morning, just in Katie's world. It had all felt like a beautiful, gauzy dream. They had danced, surrounded by fireflies and stars, her skirts swirling gracefully like something from a fairy tale, as soft strands of harp music echoed across the terrace. The evening had flown by, a cascade of bright colors, sparkling lights, and blackberry wine. Despite the haziness of the dawn, moments from the night before stood out. Walking gracefully to her seat on Joffrey's arm, Teresa's face ugly with jealousy, tiny, delicate, candied flowers drizzled in honey, her head spinning from wine and delight as Joffrey tugged her outside, collapsing on a bench, out of breath, her hair struggling out of its pearl-inlaid pins as he lifted her chin to engulf her in a kiss that had lasted for what seemed like hours. Katie groaned and rubbed exhaustion from her eyes. The muddled memories clouding her vision made her ears pound. It was too early to have this many thoughts crowding her head. With a muffled moan, she rolled over, tangling in her sheets, kicking a packet of rosemary to the ground and burying her face in the pillow. A sharp pain jabbed her scalp, and she wrestled a pin away from her curls, yelping as several hairs came away with it. A particularly vicious jolt twisted behind her left eye, and she abandoned the idea of sleep. She wasn't going to let anything ruin the floating feeling that buzzed through her entire body, making her fingers tingle and tracing goosebumps down her arms. She unceremoniously tossed her blankets aside, straightening the shift she'd fallen asleep in, and hopped off her bed onto the cold flagstones. Unfortunately, her foot tangled in the dress she had left in a crumpled pile a few hours previously, and she stumbled backwards, slamming her elbow into the carved bedpost with a painful thwack. At the same time, the door opened with a soft scraping noise, and Margot, her maid, backed into the room holding a tray. A squeak of surprise escaped Margot as Katie said several very unladylike words and rubbed her elbow. I loved that introduction from Katie. I think it is probably one of the most relatable moments in the book, right? We have all had a long night, whether or not alcohol was involved, right? And you wake up, it's too early. You were going to sleep in, but that didn't work out. That was literally me this morning, right? I woke up at 6 a.m. and I was like, well, I'm up now, right? This is great. And you're like, all right, I'm going to try. I'm just going to get up. I'm going to get my day started. And like everything that goes wrong could go wrong, right? You fall over, you hit your elbow, you've got makeup in your eyes, whatever it is. And that is authentically who Katie is. She is a princess. She's incredibly sort of powerful and well-positioned. She's a really good person. And despite the fact that she's a princess, despite the fact that she's a noble and has all these things going for her, she still has the same sort of mourning struggles that you and I do, right? She's not a mourning person. And I think Katie, unlike Alex, has never had a likability issue, right? She's charming. You're drawn in. You're like, oh, she's daydreaming. She has this beautiful life with all these lovely things, but she's realistic and she's clever, right? But the goal was to do that in a way that felt really genuine rather than really perfect, because Katie isn't perfect. She would be the first person to tell you she's not perfect. It's not that she can do everything the best. It's that there are parts of her life which are really great, and there are parts of her life which are really tough, and that's okay. Are you all right? Margot was there, gently gripping her upper arm and helping her stand. She was energized despite the ungodly hangover settling behind her eyes. I am wonderful, she declared, deciding if she said it enough, it would become true. With a heavy, patient sigh, Margot shepherded her to the sitting room, where the maid had set out a morning snack, a bowl of oats and fruit drizzled with honey and cinnamon, and a steaming mug of tea. Katie tried to read a manuscript detailing the expansion of the Mizrahi Empire as she ate, but the words swam together and she couldn't focus. Giving up on the scroll, she glanced around the room, with its sunlit window seat, tidy table, and many assorted scrolls, paintings, and books, all neatly arranged on shelves. The evening played over and over in her head. She relived every touch, every breathless, stolen kiss, and every adoring look. As her oats and tea grew cold, she gave up on eating and wandered through to the bedroom. Margot had already made her bed, piling a mound of blankets and pillows on the soft mattress. A vanity and dresser took up most of one wall, with the stool she perched on while the maid did her hair and painted her face each day. Katie paused, sniffing a new fragrance the maid had set out for later. She detected notes of lavender and sage. Deciding her day would be wholly useless if she didn't settle her mind, she entered her workroom, absently tracing her fingers over the rough walls and through the thin curtains before gathering parchment and some supplies from a table. Katie is a very tactile person. So she's the kind of person who, if she is like at Target or at a store, she is touching everything on the racks. Like she's a COVID super spreader. And that's, she lives her life sort of feeling things very, very strongly. Now, because she's a noble, because she's a princess, nobody has ever really told her that like, you can't always be over dramatic. You can't always be like touching different things and exploring different things, right? Her behavior is just treated as like, she's a noble, she can do what she wants. And the other thing that I really wanted to make sure that I was capturing is that in this world, as with many worlds with nobles, they're not self-sufficient. They don't do things alone. Katie would be an absolute mess without her maidservant, Margot, and without some of her other servants who we'll meet in a little bit. They're the ones who keep her going the right direction. They're the ones who help her get dressed. They're the ones who do her hair and are constantly trying to tame it, who clean up after her. But this is all just a privilege that's part of her life. She doesn't even sort of realize that things could be another way. She draped herself on pillows scattered across the floor and began to sketch with charcoal, tracing flowing, swirling lines as her mind drifted. Art always had a way of helping her settle 1,000 thoughts and relax. The dance had been wonderful, but in the light of morning, it was marred by Joffrey's suggestion of marriage. Before last night, she had not really taken his courtship seriously. An alliance between her family and his would strengthen the throne, but he was so predictable. His steady keel through life infuriated her. His days reminded her of recipes, a sprinkle of this, a pinch of that, with always the same result. He seemed content to glaze over the exciting details of life in favor of consistency and comfort. He was an attentive noble and a kind person, but grindingly boring. He shrugged with disinterest when she suggested adventures and rolled his eyes with her parents when Katie lost herself in daydreams. She'd long since given up on the allure of romance, accepting the order and constancy that invaded her life. Deep down, she knew it was in the best interest of her people. So we briefly met Joffrey at the very beginning of this chapter. We're now getting a bit of a fuller picture. And the picture you should be getting is of a very dissatisfying situation. And with Katie and Joffrey, I really wanted to explore a relationship that isn't passionate, but is very practical. So they're both from powerful noble families. Their marriage has been arranged. And Joffrey isn't a bad guy, right? He's not abusive. He's not manipulative. He is very authentic, but he and Katie just aren't meant for each other. And Katie is in a position where even though she's a dreamer, even though she wants nothing more than to go on adventures and see the world, she knows that what's best for her people and what her obligation is to her people is to make the right choice, have the smart marriage. And even if it means she's not happy, it means she's taking care of her people. And that's what's most important to her. And for her, after Alex left, she really committed herself to that life. She really accepted that this is all that there is ever going to be, right? I had my one great love. It's gone now. And I'm going to move forward and do what's best for my people. One of the big ways she copes with that is through art. Spinning in dreams, the world that drained from her fingers into the charcoal was intoxicating and maddening, full of divine power and magic, with brave heroes and adoring villagers. It was a world of dynamic opposites, abhorrent horrors, noble sacrifice, endless sorrow, and overwhelming jubilation all rolled together. It was a gilded pastel world, she knew, but it was so much more delicious than the harsh lines of reality. When Margot came to fetch her, Katie had straightened her thoughts and poured the tangle of emotions into her charcoal. The maid handed her a mug of something that smelled like spearmint and lemon, and with 3 hard swallows, the remaining cobwebs and honeyed thoughts that slowed her brain was gone. She blinked furiously several times as her head began to pound in earnest and swore under her breath. That was awful, she said to Margot, slowly pushing herself off the floor and accepting the maid's offered hand. I wouldn't know, my lady. Margot's eyes twinkled and Katie rolled her own. A sharp, twisting pain centered behind her eyes as she did so. Finishing the tea should help with your head, the maid said wisely. So this moment, another one of those sort of authentically relatable moments. I can't count the number of times, particularly in like my senior year of college, where it was a late wine night. I maybe drank too much and I woke up and I was like still a little drunk, right? Still a little sort of goofy and off the wall. But then at some point that alcohol wears off and you're sitting there and like your head hurts and you feel kind of nauseous and you're like, oh my gosh, right? What did I do? And so this is Katie now sort of coming out of that party, right? She's coming down the other side of the mountain and she's dipping down into this hangover. Fortunately for her, she lives in a world where, you know, a cup of healing tea can sort of fix things. She did as she was told, swallowing the bitter, steaming concoction as quickly as she could and burning her tongue in the process. Hag's teeth, she muttered as she bit her aching tongue, but the drink did help and the pounding in her head eased. How much wine did I drink? The maid pursed her lips as she guided Katie to a silken poof in front of the mirror, pressing lightly on Katie's shoulders to settle her into place. I couldn't possibly say, Margot responded dryly. That doesn't sound good at all. Katie scratched her nose as Margot fussed over the tangled mess of hair that had once been shining, delicate curls. Be honest with me, she caught her maid's eye in the mirror. Margot smiled. It wasn't nothing, my lady. Master Joffrey really had too much to drink. You just couldn't back down from the competition. You two disappeared for a while and came back all giggles and blushes, but that boy has no idea what he's doing, so... She cut herself off, and Katie felt her cheeks flame. A moment passed, then both women collapsed into stitches of laughter. When the maid stepped back, several moments later, Katie had been transformed. Her tangled mess of curls artfully cascaded over her shoulder, and the shadows under her eyes had melted away. She looked fresh and bright, as though she'd slept through the night and had spent a leisurely morning relaxing. Thank you, she said politely as Margot held out an undergown for her to step into. I love Katie, Margot, and Merrick, who you're about to meet. They're probably my 3 sort of favorite relationship in the book, because Margot and Katie have this wonderful, genuine sort of female friendship where the maid sort of takes care of Katie and keeps her as much as she can on the straight and narrow, keeps her focused. Merrick is sort of this like older brother figure to both of them who takes care of them and keeps Katie safe. And Katie at the heart of it has this just like genuine want to have people around her who treat her normally, who don't treat her like this, you know, all-powerful noble, but just treat her like a 20-something young woman. And Margot and Merrick are really the only people who do that. Finishing dressing, Katie swept from her suite, eager to start her day. Good morning, my lady. Her longtime bodyguard, Merrick Adley, nodded at her as she emerged from Margot's clutches. A tall man with muscle that came from hard fighting and discipline, Merrick kept her safe as long as she could remember. He led a small contingent of the Rose Guard, the elite personal bodyguards of the ruling family of Rosemore. It is, isn't it? Katie lifted her arms and spun around, skirts whirling. I love the morning after a good party. Everything feels slightly magical. Of course, my lady. Merrick fell into step behind her. On a whim, she decided to take the long way to the Great Hall. She was in no hurry to sit in an uncomfortable wooden chair to make small talk with courtiers or listen to a lecture from her father. The day was simply too fresh and too beautiful. Yanking open one of the doors, which led to the castle walls, she tilted her face up towards the sky. She closed her eyes, letting the warm summer sun soak into her skin. A cool breeze tinged the air with the first quiet breaths of autumn. I love this moment because there's this really cool parallelism with what we just saw Alex doing, right? They feel the same sort of wintry breeze. She's on top of the castle wall around the same time that he's riding up to the castle gate or has just passed through it. And so there's this sort of moment where it's this dramatic irony, right? These two characters are really close to each other, but they don't yet know the other one is there. But you guys, the audience, are in on the secret. So you're sort of waiting to see what happens next. Opening her eyes, she strode along the wall. I wonder if the Players Guild finished sourcing the new costumes for Aya's performance, she said, musing out loud. The shipments were due in from Torin yesterday. The Harvest Festival, 3 short weeks away, had presented a never-ending list of details for her to arrange. You think I made the right choice with the chrysanthemums, right? She glanced over her shoulder at Merrick. I've always liked chrysanthemums, the older man agreed amiably. Me too. Katie paused, looking out over the front gates. Again, just a great moment of interaction between them, right? Where Merrick is always there. Wherever Katie is going, wherever she's traveling, he's following her. He's literally her shadow. And this idea that Katie is one of those people who likes to talk and process out loud. And Merrick is just sort of this world-weary warrior who's like, you know what? Sure. Like chrysanthemums are your thing. I think that's awesome. You clearly need somebody to say yes right now. But they have this sort of comfort in their relationship. The sun was just starting to claw its way into the sky, shafts of light dappling the valley that stretched below her. A deep sense of pride settled in her chest. All of this was hers. In the city, she knew merchants headed to the market. Temple mages led prayers to Kaldir, Aya, and the plethora of other gods who dotted the pantheon. Fleets of fishing boats already scoured Feather Lake and the Twin River, hunting for the day's fresh catch. Do you think we'll be invaded? She asked as her mind began to wander, glancing at Merrick again. The guard snorted. I'd consider it unlikely, my lady. Nothing, of course, is impossible, but I'm not particularly worried. Sighing, Katie braced her hands on the stone and leaned forward, looking down the hill. I was reading about the invasion when the Mizrani conquered Rosemore. Is it true they used flags to send messages on the battlefield? In her mind's eye, war raged in the idyllic, bountiful valley below, smoke billowing towards the sky in long, dark columns. So, this moment, you're really starting to get into Katie's mind and this idea that she is one of these people who jumps from one idea to another with very little transition. I'm not one of these people. I try to have a very sort of logical train of thought. But we all know people like this who just their minds are in so many different places that they're sort of scattered, right? So Katie, she's thinking about this harvest festival. Then she remembers she was reading this scroll earlier about the expansion of the empire. And she's like, like, I wonder what that looked like when I was here. And because she has this huge imagination, it's immediately there for her. It's like she's reliving it. And she can see the smoke. She can see the sort of people around here. And what we get into here in a moment is sort of the heart of Katie and Merrick's relationship, which is that Merrick is often sort of the calm, wise one compared to Katie's sort of passionate urges and thoughts and sort of scatteredness, where Merrick has been through war. He's been through conflict. He's fought. He's lost people. And he's been here protecting Katie after that. Sort of he decided he couldn't be on the front lines anymore. And it's not something he talks about a lot, right? I have friends who serve, and it's not something they enjoy talking about frequently, but it's something that colors their lives. And so when Katie has this moment where she's just daydreaming and she's thinking, Merrick feels comfortable enough with her to sort of bring up, like, you need to think about this other side as well. I, my lady, still do as far as I know. That's a practice our provincial guard has adopted, since many of them are veterans of the Imperial Army. He stepped next to her, following her gaze out over the valley. I'm not hoping for a fresh battle anytime soon, my lady. We've enough trouble with the Danon border. The clash of swords and yells of soldiers faded from her ears. You're right. I suppose it's a terrible thing to wish for. She continued her trek along the wall. War is glorious until you're the one on the field of battle, my lady, Merrick replied, his tone peaceful. It's not a thing that I want. Katie started down the steep stone staircase cut into the wall, making her way into the courtyard and past the temple. Weaving through the tidy trees and blossoming beds of flowers, she headed towards the great hall. On the step outside, she paused, turning on her heel back to her bodyguard. You know I didn't mean it, she said earnestly, looking at him. As much as I might wish for adventure, I'd never want it at that cost. Merrick smiled at her. Nothing to worry about, my lady. If you're any later to breakfast, however, Lady Brousseau might start a war of her own. She yelped as she realized he was right and bounded through the door. So that is chapter 1 and then chapter 3. We skipped chapter 2 because it's also from Alex's perspective. But something I am really proud of is how different those chapters feel. And especially when you think about the parallelism that exists. I did that really purposefully. I actually backed up and wrote this chapter of Katie's chapter 3 fairly late in the process, after I had a full draft, because I really wanted that moment where you, the audience, you've just been with Alex, you've seen him riding up to the castle, you've seen the world through his eyes, and I wanted to give you that exact same world, right? Katie's standing there on the battlements looking at the same valley Alex was just looking at, but seeing it from an entirely new perspective. Because, one of the big themes of the book is that different perspectives aren't bad, right? Seeing things differently isn't bad. Being different than other people isn't bad. It's just different. And what's important is that we listen to each other and we take things with a grain of salt, right? Don't take things simply as they're presented by one character, by one perspective. Think about where you sit in that perspective. Do you agree or disagree, right? Sort of how does that all mesh together? So that introduces both characters. Those are their first 2 chapters. If you're interested, if you enjoyed it, I would love if you buy the book. If you've already gotten the book, if you are a beta reader and pre-ordered, I'm expecting your shipment soon so that I can sign those and get those out to you. If you got the ebook, you should already have that, and I really hope you're enjoying it. I had a ton of fun writing it. I love these characters. I love their relationships with each other and sort of with the world around them. And I hope this gives you a good sense of just how big this world is and how much is going on in it and how wide and diverse it is. Because we are really just scratching the surface here. These are 2 chapters out of 34 in book 1, and this is just book 1. So thank you guys so much for being here with me. Thank you guys for the comments. I read them all. If you have any questions, definitely drop me a message. Let me know. We have one more live stream that's going to be tomorrow. It's an author Q&A, which I'm really excited for. If you have any questions you want me to answer, feel free to drop them in the comments, send me a text, send me an email. I would love to answer those questions. And thank you guys so much for being here. I hope you're having a wonderful holiday season. You're staying warm if it's freezing where you are, like it is here. And yeah, hopefully Hazel will make a guest appearance tomorrow as well. So I hope you guys have a good night, and I will hopefully see you tomorrow. Bye.